with us. Again, I'm Rich Wallace, and I'm going to be moderating the discussion and Q&A session that will occur from now until we break for lunch. And I'll start off with this session with a question to the panelists, to which I will ask them to respond, as many of them as wish to, and then we'll go from there to the Q&A and ask for your participation. And so I guess a couple of things just sort of logistically and interactively with regards to the questions. You'll see that there are no microphone stands set up like in the aisles. So we have two roving microphones. And if the two of you, we have two wonderful volunteers who will be moving those around. And if you would hold up the microphones so that people know what to look for. They're very odd looking. They're called cubes, and they're actually meant to be thrown around. We're probably not going to throw them around, but that's what will be passed to you down the aisles. So once you have questions, once we get to the Q&A, we'll ask you to raise your hands. I'll call on people, really by pointing and speaking and indicating, and then one of these cubes will be passed to you. And we ask that you speak into the cube. You do not need to do anything to turn it on. It's all controlled by the wonderful folks, Cameron and Patrick in the back, and as is all the AV, and we're very grateful to them. Things have been going so smoothly. And so that's sort of how things will go. I'm going to start with a couple of comments and then a question. And I think what I'd like to do, actually one more announcement, and that is just so that you know, and quite unfortunately, sadly, both Jonathan Schechter and Bob Keiter have to leave a little early. So if you see them get up, we will
go off in a huff?
Exactly. It is not because there's a problem on stage, but it's because they both have to catch a flight, actually the same flight, so they have to leave at a certain period of time. They will take their leave. We will continue with the discussion here until we break for lunch. So just so that you expect that will happen. So what an amazing set of presentations, an enormous number of insights that we have heard and been asked to consider on social and ecological and economic and development trends and the larger political trends. And I think what I would like to do to start us off is to pull threads really from each of the presentations. I'm not going to repeat the presentations. I'm not going to do any summaries, but what I'm going to say is going to, I hope, resonate with you from the things that you've heard. And I think probably particularly Todd's, because I've thought about these presentations in a way that I wanted to sort of make a couple of comments that would flow. And so the flow, I think, especially comes from some of the comments that Todd made early in his presentation, but that each of the folks from whom we've heard spoke to. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to start off the discussion by asking all of you first to focus on the current situation you have so well sort of documented and illustrated for us, but from a particular angle. So I would like to ask you to consider the deteriorating norms of policy, law, governance, leadership that we are now experiencing, and specifically their impact on the younger and aspiring professionals. And I see we have a good number in the audience, which is lovely. And this is something that I think is unspoken, but an incredibly important thread. Folks who are in their early and mid-20s, aka Gen Z, have come of age politically since 2016. And that's a significant thing, the period of time since then, right? That's the beginning of Trump's first term. A lot of the long-term data that they've heard from you this morning is not something that they've experienced firsthand, but what they have experienced firsthand are these changing norms. These folks have grown into political consciousness in a really anxious and fraught time, right? We hear and think and talk about the rise of authoritarianism in our national leadership. We recognize that we have a two-party system, but one party appears to have capitulated to that authoritarianism. The US Supreme Court often acquiesces to executive power. There's a lot of stuff going on. So it's hard for all of us, but I think particularly folks of that generation, and I'll put a personal note in here that I think I'm the youngest person on stage and my kids are in their mid-20s, so I'm thinking about this from their perspective as well. It's hard for us and for them to look at actions like the current dismantling of the Forest Service, the rescission of the roadless rule, the loss of protections for wildlife, and wilderness management areas, the disregarding of public input into regulatory processes, right? The roadless rule rescission, the Forest Service released a statement of intent to do a draft environmental impact statement, and hundreds of thousands of comments were submitted, 99% of which supported the roadless rule, but we still expect that draft environmental impact statement to be issued with the finding that the roadless rule should be rescinded. So these are not things that we feel can simply be recovered or rebuilt before catastrophe occurs, or that in the wake of catastrophe we should set goals to return to some prior status quo. Rather, perhaps we should be prepared to build something new. And I'm just going to pull out a little bit of data, but about human beings, because, and we've heard about this already this morning. Take the two dominant federal agencies with which we are concerned here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. According to the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, and so this is federal data, you get to decide how trustworthy it is. The Forest Service has lost more than 12,500 staff since the beginning of last year. That's a 32% reduction. The National Park Service has lost about 4,000 staff for a 24% reduction. Younger folks looking for jobs see these profound changes to the workforce, and they and we need more than we can get back to before. So I want to sort of end this statement that I'm making here by reading from, very briefly, from an essay written by somebody in their mid-20s. This is by Beverly Whiteka and was published a couple of months ago in the Fulcrum. Trump's second term has made something very clear. Policies enacted quickly and without regard for long-term consequences leave damage that will take generations to undo. Executive orders, funding shifts, and rollbacks may feel temporary in the moment, but their cultural and systemic effects are long-term. This phenomenon has repeatedly been proven over the course of history. For example, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, which included the three strikes rule, further increased recidivism and mass incarceration of communities of color, which ultimately reshaped black families and communities for decades. Long after the administration that passed it left office, we still see the effects of this bill today. The lesson is simple but often ignored. Policy outlives presidents, and culture outlives policy. What is being set in motion now will shape the economic, educational, and social realities Gen Z and future generations inherit long after this administration ends. Ultimately, this is setting up Gen Z to be the so-called cleanup generation. Those of us born in the late 1990s and early 2000s inherited a blueprint. Get an education, start a career, buy a home, build a family, create generational wealth, contribute to your community, and leave the world better than you found it. And we believe in that, and so far we have shown up. Gen Z has been one of the most progressive, civically engaged generations, leading calls for racial justice and social and political accountability here in the United States and abroad. We have planned to be on the right side of history and have dreams and goals of our own while at it. But the generations that have come before us hold all the power. And these policies are making it more difficult for us to reach a baseline of stability. We are carrying the responsibility of environmental collapse, generational debt, institutional racism, and a political climate unraveling in real time. Yet the systems that claim to need us keep pulling away the tools required to meet the moment. The blueprint was handed to us, yet the foundation keeps shifting. So I would like to ask us to talk for a minute about how we would advise these aspiring conservation professionals. We've talked some about future generations already, though briefly and maybe elliptically. But I think that we have a real responsibility to think about the role of those to whom we are handing the responsibility that we've talked about today. And so I would ask you please to think about that generation represented here in the audience and by our children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews and grandnieces and nephews, and give for the room, for those present and those watching, the advice that you have to give. I'm happy to call on somebody or let anyone who feels like responding first.
Looking at me?
Sure.
That's what I was afraid of.
It's on. It's on. You just hold it up.
Is this on?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. There's a lot there. I can respond to some of it, and my response, I think, will be in part optimistic, in part quite pessimistic. But let me take a crack at the big picture and then come back to the GYE. Big picture in terms of generational differences and the challenges facing current generations. I'm cautiously optimistic in the sense that, I've taught for, frankly, 50 years young people, both in this state and Utah, who've come from all over the country. And I have observed them dive into the issues of the day and to make major differences, whether it's in the conservation realm or in other realms. It has not been easy. I am particularly concerned about the economic problems confronting today's generation, along with, as mentioned, some of the political challenges in the current administration and in particular the aftermath of that. Some of the chaos that has been and is being created among governmental agencies, et cetera, some of which is unparalleled that we've experienced, at least that I can recall. But by the same token, I do recall being at that stage in life when there was a lot of chaos happening within our country, thinking of the civil rights struggles of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Vietnam conflict, divisions within our country, hard-fought presidential elections, etc. And our institutions held. I know many of us are despaired at the current situation where we have basically three branches of government that are not performing the sort of checks and balances that we've come to expect from our constitutional democracy. But I have hope that that will kick in and that we will see at least some meaningful responses to some of the overextensions, particularly of executive power and of the failure of Congress to respond in any meaningful way to the encroachment, I should say, on its powers. The courts are an open question. My sense currently is that the lower federal courts have been responsive and to many of the issues that have been presented to them by particularly executive actions during the last year and a half. I'm afraid I can't say the same thing for the Supreme Court, and that's troubling. But we have elections, and they have consequences, and we're not that far from at least a midterm election, and I suspect that we may see at least some shifts in the political balance of power within Congress that in turn could have an impact on what's happening. Finally, just bringing it back to home here in GYE, there are a number of things that are afoot, particularly with the current administration, that are very troubling. You've heard several of them on stage. We haven't yet seen quite the impacts on the ground, but at least some of them can be directly addressed. Probably the most enduring one that's been mentioned that concerns me is the hollowing out of the, particularly the federal agencies. And I think that speaks to the need for local communities and perhaps the states to step forward to fill in some of that void. I'm not advocating any transfer of lands or responsibilities, but I think that will take some time to rebuild the federal agencies, and it will be a challenge. I'll just leave it there and let others chime in.
Thank you, Bob. Let me go to Susan and then Andy.
I want to go to Rich's key question about advice to younger people. And even though I've worked about 60 years in this region, I've also worked in 14 countries. And I've been really fortunate to teach in a professional school, not an academic department. Professional schools are like schools of law, medicine, and the one I taught in. So it's about combining ideas with practice. So what I do with my students, and I've had them from 30 countries, and I've been teaching long enough to see many of them come really good in the world, I try to teach them the basic skills and perspective they're going to need to survive and be effective. And I won't spend time going into what that skill set is, except it's about how to understand what real problems are and why they are problems and the values conflicts that come with them. So you give them a perspective and a set of tools to understand that in real terms. Academic departments don't do that. And usually most courses don't do that. So that toolkit of problem solving and skills is there to be had, but it's not taught hardly anywhere. Students find it incredibly empowering. Along with that, I help them understand who they are and why they're motivated the way they are and why they think that way. And we call that standpoint clarification. So once you're clear on who you are and kind of what you want to do, and you enter the world of conflict and the messiness, which is the real world, with that skill set, they have a way to go forward. And without those, a lot of people coming out of conventional programs who want to do good, they simply don't have that standpoint clarity, nor the skill set to deal with the complexity and messiness. And the last thing I teach them is, or try to teach them through dialogues, through transformative education, not just imparting information. So it's a two-way street dialogue that's really complex over several months, is endurance, being clear who you are and what you stand for. So it's not about hoping to win every battle. It's about being clear about what you stand for and how to be persistent and be resilient and hang in there for the long haul.
Wonderful, thank you. Andy?
My frame of reference, like Bob's, is also undergraduate students at universities and graduate students. And my sense is that we don't need to give advice to this generation because they're incredibly talented. I've noticed over the years how, for example, senior undergraduates are much more worldly. Each 10 years I see this transition towards the students becoming much more worldly, much more experienced, have a much stronger set of tools with which to build careers with, and are highly motivated. So, and at the same time, many of them have a set of values that their families led them to, that are the values that we all grew up with. I think I'm seeing them do really well despite these hard times. I think the hard times have bred a resilience within. And so I think we can be optimistic that many in this generation will be striving to make the world a better place, and will have success. I do worry, particularly in these last 2 years. Government and society has largely shifted from trying to serve family and community to what's in it for me, a selfish, self-gain perspective, and a deliberate lack of honesty perspective. And I hope that the people that are perhaps in their teen years that are really impressionable now don't embrace that selfish, dishonest approach to life, but rather really see the value of family, friends, community. The only advice I found myself giving my students was, you're coming of age in a very pessimistic time with challenges that seem insurmountable. The one thing that we all have to do is do our best to try to make a difference. And I've been seeing those students as they progress doing just that.
Thank you. Jonathan?
Todd, do you mind if I go? Because Bob and I have to blow out of here in about 2 minutes. First of all, thank you to everybody up here, everybody in the audience, Dan RCC. I'm not being falsely modest. When I was asked to serve on this panel, I wasn't really sure why. I wasn't sure what I could contribute, given the stature and the contributions of my fellow panelists. And as I thought about the presentation, what you heard earlier was sort of an ad lib, because this idea of reframing, I hadn't really thought about that when I was putting together the presentation. So I was thinking about that a lot and was trying to weave it into my narrative. And the 3 points that I would leave in response to your prompt, Doug, Rich, excuse me. The first is, I keep thinking about something that John Adams wrote 250 years ago about facts being stubborn things. And we are living in a little period where, thanks to social media and other mechanisms, we're paying a lot of attention to things that aren't facts. And it's the loudest voices. But facts are stubborn things, and they persist. And we're here because of we've gotten to where we are as a society because of a lot of facts and the accumulation. And what they're telling us is something very different than what we're experiencing, but they're not going away because they are stubborn things. And the second thing that comes to mind is that because of this conflict, because of the tension between the institutions that have built up and what's been happening with the information and now with AI, the framework we have is being blown up. And it gets back to my third point, which is what I was trying to express in the presentation. I think the pieces are there. The question, what we don't have is the framework for reassembling them, because the things that I've heard from Bob and from everybody else, I don't have any doubt about the talent. I don't have any doubt about the passion. I don't have any doubt about the willingness to make a difference. What we're missing is that framework and the perspective on how we're looking at how to assemble these pieces into a way of thinking about things that are different and are appropriate for the times. And I'll close with one final thought that hit me the other day about where I read an article about AI all of a sudden destroying computer science as a career because all of a sudden there's no job guarantee, just to go to school to be a coder. Are we going to see a renaissance of liberal arts, of the humanities? Because, and it seems like an odd thought, but if all of a sudden Claude or some other system is going to be doing all the coding, what's going to be missing from that is humanities, is 3,000 years of wisdom of us as a humans. And where are we going to get that? We're not going to get it from artificial intelligence. We're going to get it from the kind of liberal arts. And I think that framework that I'm struggling to try and understand is going to be a function of us tapping into something fundamental, which is millennia of history, and it's evolving in sync with the ecosystem and the feeling that you get when you're in nature and the things that we respond to as humans. That's another very stubborn fact that ain't going away. Thank you. We got to go. Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Our thanks to Jonathan and Bob, and safe travels. Todd.
One of the things that I do is I look at engagement of how do you engage the public, because if you write a story and nobody reads the story, it has an existence value of null, right? I think it's less about getting the politics right and more about getting the values right, because it is political ping pong that we've been seeing. One administration comes in, issues executive orders, the next administration cancels those, and so on. And I don't know about you guys, but when I talk with university students, one of the beefs is, why is everyone in the audience a bunch of gray hairs, right? Where are the young people? And so I ask college students, you know, nobody told us to turn out when we were your age to get excited about grizzly bears or wolves or the environment. And if our parents had said, we insist that you do that, we would have said, get lost. And so there's, you know, besides the obvious thing of technology completely transforming the way we live our lives and the gadgets, one of the things that I see, and I've been observing this for 10 years, is there is a yearning for the public to rally around a big idea and leadership. And I think one of the problems in Greater Yellowstone is that the conservation movement has become fragmented over the recreation versus protection of wildlife divide. In some cases, the recreation industry has pushed back because they want to monetize all of us to buy more stuff. We're all recreationists, but it becomes conservation that's conditional upon our use. And that's not good for wildlife. What's interesting is that every single public opinion poll, every single one across the board, Republicans, Democrats, BIPOC, people value wildlife. We care for it. It teaches us to have compassion, empathy in ways that we don't have for each other, but we'll do it in a humble and modest way. And so one of the things that's been kind of frustrating is the fact that nobody has stepped forward in this place that's supposed to be the icon of ecosystem thinking. Nobody is courageous enough to push a vision. You know, a vision that uses the wildlife migration corridors as a superstructure, that says we need to treat wildlife migration corridors with the same level of reverence that we treat rivers. They've been on the landscape as long as rivers have, since glaciers have melted. And I think, finally, that I think we've gone about planning wrong, in that we plan and then we expect wildlife to adapt. And you can see it in every valley and you can see it in every region. Go to Colorado or the Wasatch Front and you see what happens when you develop first and expect wildlife to adapt. It never works out very well. And so we have it backwards. But what we still have here in Greater Yellowstone are two things. One is we have a little bit of time before we watch it unravel. And the second thing is we have this incredible baseline of science that exists here. We don't need more studies to show us what the infrastructure is. So, may I add one more thing? Is that Greater Yellowstone isn't like other areas. And we all know this in the room. It's not like California, it's not like Arizona, it's not like the Colorado Rockies. We still have all of these critters here, and it's a miracle. And our job is not to destroy it, it's not to bring it back and rewild. Our job is just not to lose it. And so I think that one of the things that's really powerful is the power of an idea. You can build a movement behind an idea. And I think that wildlife conservation in our American Serengeti could be one of these things that rallies people together in ways that doesn't exist today. So.
Thank you. Thank you all for engaging that question. I think that we will now pivot to questions from any and all of you. And actually, if I can ask the folks in the control room a favor before we get started, if we could have the house lights up, because the audience is pretty dark for us on the stage, and since we're going to be taking questions from the audiences, it'd be nice to be able to see you all better than we can. So if that's possible, that'd be great. They're at full? Okay, so it may just be that the spots that are on us are washing you out a bit. And with that, we'll take questions. Okay, I see a hand over here and then a hand in the back. So we'll start over here on the aisle.
Okay, this is weird. With the box. But my 4-year-old would have loved it. I just want us to maybe consider that by accident, certainly not design, the Trump administration may have done us a favor by burning down all the existing infrastructure, because there was no way it was going to get us to where we need to go. We've been stymied, stuck in status quo and trying to cling on to that for such a long time, and thinking that somehow these systems that got us to where we are right now are going to somehow be the answer going forward, and I don't think they can be. And I think this is what Todd was kind of moving in that direction of, if we could redesign, this is the time to really be doing that. And I just want us to not feel the despair of what we've lost, but the opportunity of what we can gain right now, because we were not going to solve the climate crisis. We're not going to solve the Fish and Wildlife Service biological endangered species crisis by the existing infrastructures that we had in place. So yes, let the young people imagine what can take that place. Let them create, and let's follow and just give them all the support we possibly can pour into them to create something that will get us to where we need to go. Yeah.
Thank you. There wasn't a question, but a statement, but if anyone wants to respond, otherwise we can move on to the next. Okay. We had a yes, in the back. Francis?
I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but there's been a lot of talk about the vision and a framework to help rebuild too. And I'm also hearing that the polling shows that everybody cares about the environment, they care about the wildlife. What I don't know is really, how do you define that caring? Because I see people who say they care about the wildlife, and yet then they still want to ride the bicycle up through it. And so we're not kids anymore. I know there's been a lot of effort to get kids to care about the environment. That hasn't really worked very far as I can tell, unless some of you came through that. But what does this caring really mean? What's that vision? What's that framework? And how do we work with the adults who are making decisions now to really understand what caring means, and then how to activate that?
process, Karen?
It's hard to answer that real simply. Given what everybody said here, if you want the next generation to be more successful at taking these tasks on, they need to have a skill set that's really pragmatic. It's not about good intentions. It's not about being young and energetic. It's having a skill set to grasp the reality of problems and the interaction of people and how decision processes unfold, and a lot more I won't go into. And that set of considerations I'm referring to have been articulated in a practical framework that I have been teaching for decades and students all over the world are using to great success. So that's already out there. But we need to get that skill set known to more people, especially young people. You don't solve problems with good intentions and a lot of energy. You got to be tactically and strategically smart. And you also need to understand yourself well enough that you can be resilient through all the ups and downs that are coming. So I wish I had more time to talk about the content of this skill set, because it's really, really useful. And what I have found is really experienced people, like some of the folks in the audience, independently reinvented on their own. But they're unaware of the fact, oh, I only have part of the skill set. But to me, that's the way forward here. We need to transmit as quick as possible through workshops, education, cases, whatever it is, the kind of skills that are commensurate with the type of problems that we're being confronted with. And conventional approaches don't cut it. Business as usual doesn't cut it. We need skill sets that can deal with the complexity, the integration problems, the political problems, the rational problems, and the moral problems all at the same time. And those frameworks do exist. And some people are open to learn that and use them, and some people are not. So it's not like we don't have a way to go forward.
To comment to your question, but also I think the thread runs through the questions asked so far. In the past, crises have led to new frameworks, have led to new ways of thinking. So we think about how our rivers caught fire and how pesticides were killing even species like ospreys and eagles. Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's book, is just an example of documenting crisis, and through doing so, really opening up people's eyes to the problems, leading to people coming together to come to solutions. And I just wonder, I know among the conservation groups I'm involved with, we talk a lot about how the younger generation perhaps does not have the same concept of the importance of wilderness that perhaps the older generation has, because we grew up before these places were protected. We came of age as they were being protected. We came to really appreciate how those various environmental laws made a difference. But I just wonder too if things now are at such a crisis state that there's a real opportunity, as has happened already this morning in this meeting, to really try to get the discussions going with all the generations about how deep the problems are now, in hopes that we really frame powerful new approaches and really try to empower the younger generations to make good on that, to lead that progress. Now, I don't know, I think we've been so shell-shocked through the unthinkable happening on so many fronts. But maybe we're now getting to the point where we can really put together the pieces of seeing what a crisis we really are in, and how to make progress on that. So I think that was fairly insightful, your comment, and maybe that's a basis for trying to step forward.
So real quick, briefly, I'm part of a big discussion group called the Great Transition Initiative. You can Google it and look it up and join it if you want to. And the current discussion is how you create social movements that are effective. And some fantastic people in this dialogue who have great experience about how to do that. We have examples currently, like in Minnesota. And what we need here, in addition to what folks have said, we need to catalyze a social movement of appropriate scale to deal with the greater Yellowstone ecosystem's challenges. The crisis is already here. That's why I use the phrase quiet crisis. No one's out there with dynamite blowing the place up. But from all our descriptions, there's clearly at the bottom it's falling out of the system. And that is a crisis. Maybe we need to advertise that more. And as Andy said, people tend to organize and respond to crises. And that's where things change. But we need people who understand how to organize crises, how to organize movements that are effective. So there's a lot of things in this system that are missing, some key ingredients like strategic leadership, high order thinking, organizing social movements. All these things are key to the future, but they're currently missing.
Francis, that was a great question. Because if we asked all of you, how many of you support wildlife conservation, everyone's hand would go up. And then the next question would be, do you think we should take action? And all of your hands would go up. And then the third question is, what would you individually be willing to do? And ultimately, it's not a very complicated thing. It comes down to making space for animals on the land. It's habitat. It's not any complicated than that. And I would argue that what transcends age difference, somebody has said, and I think Andy can affirm this, is that we had a better environmental wherewithal 20 years ago about Greater Yellowstone than we have today. And we've been inundated by a lot of people coming here. Not with malintent, they just don't know. They're coming from suburban or urban environments, and nobody is there. Again, I'm going to push this on the conservation movement, but we've regressed in terms of our education about ecology. And we don't have it in our education system along with civics or anything like that. We're in retreat. But one of the things that changes, and I'm going to throw this on you because it will change you and you're going to curse me for this. But if you think about what a grizzly bear mother with cubs or what elk moms with calves, if you start to empathize with wildlife and you think about the world that they're entering and having to navigate, it changes the way you think about things instead of this human-centric thing of, how many miles am I going to ride this summer on my mountain bike? And I think that we have to, I don't know what the answer is of how we engage people to educate people about ecology, but when you live here, you have to live differently than where you came before. This is the only place like it. And I don't think we're doing a very good job of educating people about consequences. And then one thing about elected officials, because they play an important role. When was the last time that you heard a mayor or a city commissioner or a county commissioner or a governor or a member of Congress or a senator stand up and champion ecology and empathy for wildlife that benefits their states? I can't remember a time, maybe Dan Kemmis in Missoula, but if you don't have leadership coming from the people we elect, and if they don't mention it, it doesn't register. So you can't protect something that doesn't register. So again, I think that wildlife is a really powerful thing because we all love it so much, but there's sort of rules of the road responsibility if we're going to live here. That includes rural subdivision, it includes outdoor recreation, and I think it starts with adults having conversations with young people of getting them to empathize with the, just by being there, we impact critters and displace them, so. Thanks for the question.
Before we move on to the next question, I actually want to make a quick comment in response to Francis' question about care, which I think is really thought-provoking as well. And that ties back to the earlier discussion, and that is that thinking about communities of care is actually one of the things that gives me great hope. I mean, in the political hellscape that's been the last 14 months, we look for hope where we can find it when you're in the trenches doing work that is under constant threat. And there are so many communities now of care. I mean, we're talking about the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, we're talking about wildlife, we're talking about wilderness, and that is very familiar territory. But we have also communities of care about the federal workforce, about the state of democracy, little d democracy, about election integrity, about all of these other concerns which are, either they're in the background causing us anxiety or they are having direct effect on the things that we're doing on a daily basis, if those are involved in with wilderness conservation or wildlife conservation. And the communities of care that have developed around all of these issues is actually a great source of empowerment. And I want to close by just putting in a shameless plug for later in our agenda, and that is that our keynote address tonight is Christina Cromley-Brunner, who's sitting here. Christina, would you just wave, please? And she's going to be talking a lot about these larger communities of care that are working really hard to keep our processes in place such that we can continue to work on things like the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and wilderness management and wildlife conservation. Thank you. Back to the questions. Wow, so many. Let's go.
Up with this.
Sorry. Go ahead. You got it.
All right. Speaking into the box. So I'm picking up on ideas of in the collapse or maybe some opportunities, and I'm going to be looking at opportunities to have tribal sovereignty manage buffalo recovery nationwide on all public lands. So, and I'm doing that not necessarily, I live in white space. White space is a transactional, 99% transactional space. I'm more comfortable in Indian country. That is a relational space. And what I hear some of you saying, communities of care, innovative ways of doing things. I'm restoring buffalo across the continent under tribal leadership to build and rebuild my relationship with my relative, with our relative. And so moving, I know that in Indian country we can rebuild our relationships with our non-human relatives. And we're doing so on reservations across the country. I work in white space, I have to understand it, but how do the rest of the mainstream take a look at rebuilding relationships in this time when we do need communities of care and relationship around our non-human relatives and our keystone species, we are keystone species and part of this environment. So I don't know how to do relationship in white space in a 99% transactional structure. I can do relationship in Indian country, and we're doing that. We'd like to work with you to get there.
Dallas, that's a great question. And as you well know, if you go to Fort Peck, if you go to Wind River, Indian country is doing it on their own without seeking permission. They don't need to have permission because they're sovereign nations and they have their land. You know, it's interesting, isn't it, in Greater Yellowstone that you have Wind River, which is as large as Yellowstone National Park. And Wind River is going about reestablishing relationship with non-human beings there and doing it quietly. And it's, you know, it's happening. I think it's happening. What's the story? The two-boat wampum of side by side going back to the start of colonialism on the continent. I'm not sure how that's going to be reconciled in today's environment. But it's really inspiring to see what's happening in Indian country with Yellowstone bison and with, it's really a renaissance of bison that's happening out there. And it's really happening off the radar. That's partially a media issue as well. But I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned. You know, one thing, it would be really interesting to have a map of the West that is a place name based on Indian country and place names of reference points, because a lot of them pertain to where wildlife or, right, of the land of whatever species, or it completely reorients us how we think about things instead of the Fred Johnson Memorial Bridge, right? So anyway, I think you're onto something. So
Let me try to respond. I appreciate very much how complex and nuanced the discussion is between the white dominant society and Indian folk. I grew up in Oklahoma, where roughly 30 Indian tribes were dumped there starting in the 1830s. And when I grew up, I had friends Sac and Fox, Quapaw, Kiowa, Osage, Creek, Cherokee. We were all there together. We didn't make much of a distinction that there were Indian people and white people. And being in Wyoming for as long as I have a lot of friends on the reservation too. So from that kind of perspective, I think I have an appreciation of how difficult it is to integrate across cultures in really meaningful ways. So I think one way to do that is to up the conversation. So we're really interested in human dignity here and how to treat people as though they matter, no matter where they come from. And that's about a fair society. It's about justice in many ways. And we can do bridging if we notch the discussion up. We're all committed to human dignity. And how can we do that to better everyone's life? That's a win-win situation. It's not about my group or my minority or this special interest, want my thing. So we need to develop the thought and vocabulary and ways of working to advance human dignity for everyone. And not to toot my own horn, we did a book a couple of years ago on the concept of human dignity with a lot of problem-solving exercises in it to say, what is it and how can we go ahead forward to advance human dignity for everybody?
Again, I too appreciate what you're doing with tribal lands and also for the benefit of the bison. Your comment makes me think about on non-Indian lands, are there similar groups forming, or are there similar connections being made? And in GYE, I've been impressed with how many local community to watershed scale conservation groups have formed and how successful they have been to benefit wildlife and stream health and other issues. Pretty much in every part of GYE, there's a group that has formed and is active and is being very successful. And I personally have long championed trying to have collaborative conservation across GYE, and always thought the federal agencies are well positioned to lead that. But what I've come to conclude is we've seen almost no success at the GYE scale. At the same time, we've seen these amazing successes on smaller landscapes, in watersheds, Tom Minor Basin, Centennial Valley, the Eastern Yellowstone group. And now I'm thinking personally that really the way to save Yellowstone is to recognize the importance of the sort of community that you're developing on tribal lands, but that's also being developed within these landscapes within GYE, and possibly try to empower them by helping them network so that they're trying to improve nature within their local landscape, but do so in the context of improving nature across the whole ecosystem. And so I wonder about opportunities for reframing to try to help those groups network and come together to have their successes be expanded to bigger pieces of the ecosystem.
Thank you all so much. And I'm really sorry to say that is all the time that we have for the Q&A prior to our lunch break. But for those of you who had questions who didn't get to ask them here publicly, please find our speakers in the lobby during the lunch break and engage. And please join me in thanking them, and including those who have departed, for a wonderful morning.